The first question, yes, the first question is, what is metaphor? And we're going to give this definition. Slide number 2. Yeah, what is metaphor? And the next is the definition. Metaphor is understanding and experiencing one thing in terms of another. We'll illustrate that. A metaphor is to experience or understand one thing in terms of another. And before giving an illustration of this, I'm going to define a word, the word thorn, okay? That will enhance your understanding of the example. A thorn is a small, sharp-pointed growth on the stem of some plants, such as a rose bush. But now the example. Imagine that you are in a board meeting in a company, and a board member shares her doubts regarding how the company will pay for the investment needed to expand its facilities and to hire more personnel. And suddenly there's silence until one person gives this remark. He says, "These are thorny questions you're asking, Sarah. These are thorny questions." I can assure you that no person in the room took the word thorny literally. Neither were they in doubt about the meaning of the sentence. Even if they didn't know anything about metaphors, they understood that Sarah was talking about a difficult situation, painful. So this illustration helps us understand the definition we just gave. So let's review it again with this example in mind. Metaphor is understanding one domain of experience, questions, in terms of another realm of experience, thorns. And there are two things we can learn here. One, the realms of experience could be completely different. One question has nothing to do with thorns. And second, we can't interpret metaphors literally. She's not talking about real thorny questions. Now I would like to talk about 3 types of metaphors, and we'll get to the God question soon. But let's talk first about the cultural metaphor. To be able to understand a cultural metaphor, you need to know the culture. You need to know some realities in the culture. And let me give you one example. Somebody may say, "I feel behind the 8 ball." If you haven't played pool, you won't get it. Because when the white ball is behind the 8 ball, the player doesn't have a clear shot. Because if he hits the 8 ball, he'll lose a turn. If he pockets the 8 ball, he loses the game. But if you don't know those rules and you haven't played the game, you don't know what they are talking about. Cultural metaphors require a lot of you. Now, in contrast, the second type of metaphor I want to mention is the bodily metaphor. A metaphor based on our bodies. We can say, for example, "She is really sweet." We can say, "He was left in the dark about the meeting." Or, "I had to bite my tongue not to say anything." All those are physical metaphors. We all have eaten something sweet. We all have bitten our tongue. So we can even say that the best metaphor is our own body and give us universal metaphors. I mean, every human being has a body, and if we share our bodily experience, we immediately understand what we're talking about. We don't need to learn culture. We immediately get what we're talking about. Another thing is that bodily metaphors are more persuasive. In each of these examples we quoted, the metaphorical expression is much more compelling because it triggers in the brain the memory of a direct bodily experience. It's like it calls that physical experience, and you can feel it. And that's why it's so powerful. Now, a perfect example of how powerful bodily metaphors can be is what the Reverend O'Neill Dossier, a fundamentalist, declared in 2003. He said, homosexuality is something so nasty and disgusting that it makes God want to vomit. Everybody feels the punch. Whether you are a liberal and you say, how you could, or whether you're fundamental, yeah. Whatever you feel, because vomit is a physical thing that you immediately touches you. Dossier, this fundamentalist, could have said, God disapproves of same-sex attraction, right? That's literal. But this prosaic language pales in comparison with the powerful physical image of vomiting. And in my book, I deal with so many aspects of metaphor, and one of those is how metaphor, especially physical ones, usually pass over your analytical capacities, your critical thoughts, and hits you in your emotions. And they are very, very dangerous. And I give many examples of how you manipulate, and politicians love to use metaphors to manipulate people just with one word that will trigger a physical memory. The third metaphor, and this is a very universal metaphor that is used every day, all the time, in music, in poetry, in science, in everywhere, is called anthropomorphism. So what is anthropomorphism? According to the Oxford English Dictionary, anthropomorphism is the attribution of human characteristics or behavior to a god, animal, or object. Again, anthropomorphism occurs when we assign human attributes, human qualities, or human behavior to gods, animals, and objects. I quote a lot of those examples in the book too, but let me share with you some here. Let's start with the animals. And here we go to slide 12. The Lady and the Trump. This is a story about two dogs that they can fall in love. They talk to each other. They go out on a date. They go into a restaurant. They sit on a table. They eat spaghetti meatballs. That's anthropomorphism. We have taken these animals and turned them into humans. Lately, my wife, not yet, but that's an object, not yet. My wife lately bought a new table for the dining area. And I have to say bye-bye to our 20-year-old table. And I took the table, I hugged my table, and I said, "You've been with us 20 years. Friends have been here. Family have been here. We've been eating around you and had so." That's anthropomorphism. Have you done something like that? You've never talked to anything? To the computer or the printer which doesn't work? Or, I mean, that's a human thing. And we'll see why we are that way. And there was a program, an old TV program that old-timers like me will remember. A horse is a horse, of course, and nobody talks to a horse, of course, unless, of course, the horse is the famous Mr. Ed. That was a program in which a horse talked with its owner, and many times the horse even was wiser. That's anthropomorphism. We humanize animals. And of course, we humanize objects. And here we go to the cartoon movie, The Beauty and the Beast, and you see there Mrs. Potts. She's laughing, she has eyes, she talks, and there's a lot of other things in that movie that are humanized, that are represented as humans, and they talk and they plan stuff and do all that. The third example is how we humanize gods. We ascribe human qualities to the gods. And let me give you 3 examples. One comes from the old Babylonian Empire. The second one comes from the Sumerian culture. And the third one from the Vatican. Well, in 1755, before Christ, the famous Code of King Hammurabi, a Babylonian king, was written in the Akkadian language in a 7-foot-tall basalt rock. Now, while Moses had only 2 tablets, this guy had a huge rock with a whole civic legislation written there. Now, at the top of the monument, and that's the slide number 14, at the top of the monument, you can see that on one side, sitting on a throne, is the god Shamash, the sun. The god is portrayed or carved as if it's a person. It's a guy sitting, is dressed, has arms, feet, has a hat, and in front of him is King Hammurabi receiving the legislation that made him so famous. The second one, the next slide, shows Inanna, a Sumerian goddess, so famous that the Romans know her as Venus and the Greeks as Aphrodite. But she's there portrayed as a woman. And finally, Michelangelo gives us the Christian God in the chapel, painted as an old guy. So let's review our definition in the next slide, number 17. What is anthropomorphism? Is the attribution of human characteristics or behavior to a god, animal, or object. Now, here we're going to get into a very important thing. It is crucial to understand that anthropomorphism functions in one way when we apply it to objects and animals, and in a complete different way when it's used to refer to the gods, including the biblical God. Let me illustrate this difference by assigning human traits to an object. Okay? Suppose I enter into the kitchen and I see on the counter an apple pie. And I say, "That pie is calling my name." I have humanized the pie. Even when the pie cannot know my name, it cannot talk, it will not recognize me when I get into the kitchen, I turn it into a person. But two things come out of this. First, if I remove the human qualities that I attributed to the pie, I still have a pie. Secondly, I can express the same thing without metaphors. I can say, oh, I really would like to eat that pie. There's no metaphors there. I can talk about the pie as a physical object without using metaphors. But notice, if I remove the human qualities attributed to a God, what are we left with? Not much. And that's the difference between using metaphors for animals and objects and using metaphors for gods. Let me demonstrate this to you with an example. Let's go to Genesis chapter 3. Then Adam and Eve heard the sound of the steps of Yahweh Elohim, who was walking in the garden during the breeze of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of Yahweh Elohim among the trees of the garden. Yahweh Elohim called the man and said, "Where are you?" He responded, "Well, I heard the sound of your steps in the garden, and I was afraid because I'm naked, so I hid myself." This is a complete anthropomorphic description of the God. You might have not thought about it, but it seems that this God has legs and feet because he walks. And you can hear him coming. He also has a mouth, not only a mouth, a hole. To talk, we really need the head as a sounding box. You need your teeth, you need your mouth, the whole apparatus that he can talk. And when Adam replies to him, the waves of his voice gets into the ears of the gods, he can understand and he replies. But what happens when you take out all of those human qualities from this God? What are we left with? There's not much left, right? I deal with this, I have a whole section to deal with this problem in my book. And however, even when that happens many times, that you're left with nothing, once you take the attributes, human attributes. However, in many cases, when we take away from the gods the human qualities ascribed to them, we are left with something. Many times we're left with impersonal forces of nature, social values, power, political power, etc. I deal with this in the book, but I would like to give you a few examples of the times we are left with something, but it's going to be in connection with the next subject, and the question here is, what is myth? And the answer is, myth occurs when we expand an anthropomorphism, a metaphor, and turn it into a story about the gods. For example, in the Bible, we find the anthropomorphism or the metaphor, Yahweh is king. When we say Yahweh is king, that's a metaphor, because his kings are humans. Humans, what we know about monarchy is all human. So we have made God into a king. And everything we know about kings are earthly kings. We turn that metaphor into a myth when we make a story about it. So it's not just that we say God is king, but we make a story, we create a story in which he's acting as one. I'm going to give you an illustration. There are two meetings. One meeting is, there are two earthly kings, Ahab and Jehoshaphat, that want to wage war against Syria, the enemy on the north. But they want to be sure that they're going to win. So they call for a meeting of the royal court, of the council of the court, to ask the prophets a word from Yahweh. What is the God saying? Are we going to win? And the prophet said, yeah, you're going to win. Don't worry, go to war. But then they turn around and ask Micaiah, another prophet, are we going to win? And Micaiah says, no, you have no chance. You're going to die. You're going to die in battle. The question immediately is, how did he know? We are told that he was given a vision into another meeting with another king. And let's go now to slide 22. It says, then Micaiah said to these kings, therefore hear the word of Yahweh. I saw Yahweh sitting on his throne. He's a king. And all the host of heaven is standing by him. The host of heaven, those are stars. Shamash is the sun. Inanna, remember I showed you a picture? That's a star, Venus. All the gods were stars, but they are personified here as human people around another God. All the host of heaven standing by him on his right and on his left. And Yahweh asked, who will deceive Ahab into marching to his death at Ramoth Gilead? Some proposed one thing and some another. Until a spirit came forward and stood before Yahweh, saying, I will deceive him. And Yahweh asked him, how? The spirit replied, I will go out as a deceptive spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. Then Yahweh responded, you will prevail in deceiving him. Go forth and do so. This passage has turned a metaphor, Yahweh is king, into a story, right? Whole story of a meeting and people talking. That is myth. Myth is only a metaphor enlarged or extended into a story about the gods. And it has to be myth, it has to be about the gods. Our pastor this morning talked about bulb, took the word bulb and made stories about it. Metaphors, one after another. But those stories were not myths. Why? Because it's not about the gods. Myth is a genre, a literary genre that is reserved only for the gods. Now, there were many uses of myth. And we can, in the book, I talked about many uses of myth, but here we're going to just mention two for you. And one of the uses, that's slide 23rd, myths were used to humanize and explain forces of nature. Humanize and explain the forces of nature. In the same way we humanize dogs and Mr. Ed, we can humanize forces of nature. And I'm going to give you three examples. The first one comes from Babylon. In the ancient world, pregnancy was a very precarious affair. Back then, people did not have proper medical knowledge, adequate housing, diet, sanitation. Therefore, women suffer from infertility, miscarriages, stillbirths, and the loss of their babies to infant mortality. natural, impersonal forces were causing these misfortunes. But instead of studying how nature works, as science does today, ancient people were absorbed in their own humanity, because humans, we believe that everything revolves around us. So when they ask why these misfortunes happen, they search for a personal agent. They were looking for purpose and meaning, which are human constructs. I mean, nature has no purpose and meaning. We have purposes and meaning. And that's what we're looking for when we ask why my kid died. And this is precisely how an ancient literary work explains these tragedies. The Book of Atrahasis is an old book written in 1700s in Babylon. It tells a story that at the beginning of the world, there were too many people. They were making too much noise, and the gods were irritated. So at the end of the story, the gods decide to reduce the population, so there's less noise, by inflicting calamities like infertility, stillbirths, etc. The decline of population was seen as the will of the gods. The death of a child or mother was not caused by diet, bacteria, sanitation, disease, but was thought to be ordained by the gods for a reason. They humanized the forces of nature by means of myth and metaphor. The second example comes from the Gospels. In the Gospel of Matthew, there's a father of a kid with epilepsy that comes to Jesus for help, saying, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he's been stricken by the moon." You never heard that translation, eh? You know why? Because many versions just take the moon out. And they translate, for example, NIV says, "He has seizures." Oh, yeah, but it's the moon. Today we know the cause and treatment of epilepsy. But in ancient times, since the times of Babylon, the Greeks, the Romans, the Gospels, people explained this illness by saying it was caused by a goddess, the moon, or a spirit sent by her. Finally, the last example, in February 2010, an earthquake devastated Haiti, killing more than 200,000 people. Man. The Reverend Pat Robertson expressed the mythic perspective by saying it was God who sent the earthquake to punish Haiti for having made a covenant with the devil. However, when we look at science, it explains the same event as a particular case of tectonic plate layering in the crust of the earth. It happens that Haiti is right where there are two plates, one coming under the other, and every time it moves a little, causes an earthquake. Now, these three cases, pregnancy in Babylon, epilepsy, and Haiti, humanized natural forces into personal gods. By imagining personal gods with human qualities, people were able to say that the gods were behind these natural tragedies and diseases. But if we remove the anthropomorphism from these three stories, we are left with impersonal incidents of nature, like infertility, miscarriages, epilepsy, earthquake. The use of myth as a way of explaining natural forces should be obsolete today, even the ones in the Bible. Science has shown the best method of how to understand reality. Now, the second, and this is the last thing, the second way of using myth is myth can be used as parables to teach and support social values. In ancient times and even today, myth and legend were used as certified vehicles for the transmission of ideals, values, and customs belonging to a community. These values help shape, unify, and protect social systems by way of stories carved into the collective consciousness. I mean, they only knew the myths. They all play with them, interpret reality by them. The whole collective consciousness of a society. For example, within Israel's patriarchal society, men thought that the subordination of women was a value. That is, male supremacy was something worthy of being protected as part of the structure of society. Therefore, Genesis chapter 2 invents a story in which Eve is created after Adam to be helper adequate for him. She is the help. Genesis chapter 3 reinforces the principle of the subordination of women by saying that it's God's punishment, just like Pat Robertson with Haiti. The text says, your longing shall be for your husband, and he shall be your master. When you put a God behind this, you're saying, this is really important. But then, even in 1 Timothy, a disciple of Paul supports the same social value of subordination. He says, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first. You see, he's quoting. Then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. Now, the problem with Genesis 2 and 3, and listen, the problem with Genesis 2 and 3 is not the fictional natural of the stories. We know they are not historical narratives. Genesis 2 and 3 never happened. The problem is that the stories were created with the purpose of endorsing the oppression of women. That's the problem with the stories. Our current values of gender equality and democracy has made the myth obsolete. However, can we keep using myths and legends today? Yes. We can use myths to communicate what we feel are the correct social values, but we need to choose myths and parables that support ideals like democracy, empathy, altruism, service, love. For example, Mark chapter 6, contains the story of the feeding of the multitude. We are told that Jesus fed thousands of people with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, we know that this story is also fictional. It's not a historical event. You can't do that. But we can confidently say it's a truthful story because it teaches the values of generosity and sharing. The legend teaches that when we are generous, there's always enough for everyone. On the contrary, Genesis 2 and 3 contains stories that are not true. Not because they are fictional, but because their purpose is to endorse oppression. Let me finish this presentation then asking again, how do we imagine God? We have already seen that the mechanism used to imagine God is metaphor. So here the question takes a different turn. What I'm asking is, what type of God do we want to imagine by means of metaphors? Do we want a God created in the likeness of a totalitarian king with dreams of absolute power? If we acknowledge the fact that our concept of God is just a mirror in which we see ourselves, anthropomorphism, are we going to humanize God by projecting the worst of our humanity? Is God the projection of our insecurity, racism, greed, hatred, and thirst for power? No. We should rather imagine a God whose nature infuses in us values of honesty, kindness, courage, loyalty, truth, wisdom, etc. Today we need a theology that recognizes the sanctity of our common universal humanity. Because above all religious beliefs, we should imagine a God through myths and metaphors that build communities of love. And that's it. Thank you for your patience. That's it. Yeah, and so I don't get into Jesus' rage. We'll send it at cost in the church. But my wife said that I should open some time for questions, if you have any questions. Again? It depends which colleagues you're talking about. I have a professor of Old Testament in Argentina that loves my book. I have another in Mexico, Alfredo Tepox, a Bible translator. He loves it. And there's another minister that really doesn't talk to me anymore. So there are different reactions. Or I have a colleague in the UK, in England, there's a very famous Old Testament theologian that wrote me an email. He said, Humberto, I believe in everything you said, but I still believe. And I said, what? I mean, yeah. Yes. Regarding the kingdom metaphor, I didn't talk about it in the presentation. I dedicate a whole chapter to prove, and I can't prove it here, that the kingdom metaphor is horrible, and we shouldn't talk any more about it, because both since Sumer, when they invented monarchy, kingdoms have been related to oppression, to tyranny. Mr. Trump was called Cyrus, the new Cyrus. Chapter 45 of Isaiah talks about Cyrus, and they say President 45. And he's an authoritarian person, And anything that sounds like kingdom sounds anti-democratic. You can't be fighting for democracy and equality and say kingdom. Unless you have taken complete, I mean, the word is meaningless. And I talk about that. I can't prove it or talk about it here, but and this is something that we have to do together. I can't say right now here what other metaphors we can, but I wonder if leaders get together and analyze metaphor and analyze theology, what new metaphors from because all these metaphors for them were contemporary. They were not talking about the past. They were using the metaphors of their lives, how they understood the world, how they see everything. And my question to Christianity that is dying because lives like 2,000 years in the past is, what metaphors are here right now in our society that can be turned into Christian talk? But that's something I dream also. I know that will never happen, and I dream that maybe in the future. I dream of commentaries that will take this approach. Because many commentaries, even the super liberal ones, any in Hermeneia or the Fortress commentaries that are, man, pure scholarship, very good. You get the text, usually translated by the author, with a lot of notes on linguistics and why he's translating the Hebrew this or that way. And then he comes and starts talking like everything is literal. You see, it's like, hello? And many of these scholars know it, but they keep talking the old stuff. So I always wonder what a new series of commentaries would be if they take this approach and help all of us, helps the minister, like interpretation commentary from Knox, Westminster Knox, is a commentary for ministers. What about commentaries written that help ministers to see the metaphor and to change it for something else? Or because every time you read the Bible, you have to go with critical eyes, because the Bible many times wants to sell me crap, and I can't accept that. When the Bible talks about Jesus, Philippians chapter 2, and I treat that passage in my book, Jesus comes and everybody's going to kneel in front of him because, no, I don't want that Jesus. I don't want a tyrant coming. So those are some dreams, but any other question? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it should be in the seminaries. But sometimes many liberals are like close to it, but never. it's like they haven't understood metaphor well. So they talk like, kind of like, but suddenly, for example, Marcus Borg, I admire the guy. He's a great guy. But every time he talks of God as a person in his books, he's like, you don't know what he wants to say. There are niches, there are many things and they are great, but sadly they like, and many professors know that and they try to communicate, but of course there's a problem of denominations and the local church. Because you can talk anything you want with your professor. But when he gets into that pulpit and when he gets to the church, he may be a short time as a pastor there. But we are right now in the process of a crisis, in the process of change, because if we don't change, we're going to close our doors. Because the old guard is passing and the new kids, they can accept this, but they won't accept. I remember my son-in-law once said to me, he wasn't even married yet, and he said that he wasn't sure about the Bible because he can't swallow Genesis 2 and 3 as historical. And I say, well, you don't need to do that. But another minister will say, well, you sinner, right? But the time of you sinner, fundamentalism is passing, and we have to wake up. The church has to, yeah.
There's a statement that I've heard many times, and it always irritates me. Ministers say it, politicians say it. 4 words, it is or was God's will. And I always think that's just an excuse for not taking responsibility.
Yeah, and it's a metaphor. I mean, what is behind the God's will is really some government that they didn't do what they should, and there was a crisis of contamination, or behind we have to be very careful with politicians. We have to always see, is that literal? For example, the Prime Minister of England, the lady, the one before the guy with the hair. No, well, she was in charge of exiting from the European Union, Brexit. And that was a mess. And nobody had an idea. And the journalist says, well, Prime Minister, what are you gonna do? How are you gonna get? And she says, oh, Brexit is gonna be a white, blue, and red Brexit. What? The colors of the flag? What do you mean it's going to be a very British? But she didn't say anything, you see. And they are great for that. I mean, I quote several examples in the book, and how metaphors, genocide only happens by the use of metaphors. Dehumanizing, not only humanizing things, but dehumanizing people is a metaphor. When you call Hispanics, for example, what was that was used about us? Wetbacks. No, but it was animals. President Trump says they are animals. That's a metaphor, because they are human beings. Yeah, but yes, a dehumanizing metaphor. And in the Tutsis and in Africa, that's another example. There was a general there that started calling them rats to the other tribe, and 90,000 people were killed because metaphor, man, buries your critical mind and just hits in, and once it hits your emotions, the mind is out to lunch. And yes. Oh yeah, those are completely myths. Yeah. The question we always have to say is, much of what we find in the Bible is not historical. It didn't happen. Doesn't mean that it loses its power or its usefulness, with the condition that there's not an oppressing agenda behind, because the people back there were not innocent. And you see that the Bible takes the side of the poor and takes the side of the rich, takes the side of the poor and oppressed, and takes the side of genocide. And we always have to say, what is behind this story? What he wants to instill in me. And if it's bad, can I redeem it? Can I change it? Or simply throw it and find another story that is good to communicate the values that we feel dear, that will sustain democracy and this world. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have anywhere near the same power as calling people vermin, right? And so how do people who are trying to promote positive change, find those mythic or metaphors that have some power so that they can motivate people to follow a positive direction?
Yeah. The church has the monopoly of the big metaphor. And again, you have to have your values in the right place, and then start cherry picking in the Bible what is good, what helps those things. And it has a very powerful, because for religious people, the word God, even Tillich said that the word God is just a superlative. The word God means this is really important. It's my ultimate concern. That's what I really think is important. And because it's important, it has to be human. It has to be personal. I mean, we personalize anything that really touches us. We can go with the personification over the humanization of those values and talk about God, but always not as a fundamentalist, because a fundamentalist is static. It doesn't change. Values, in 30 years, maybe we will find we were wrong about something. But values change, and maybe our metaphors will change, but we can still use myths and legends. Yeah. I would say it could, yes and no. I have my, you can use the lectionary in a way that many times you will have to just put that passage in the wastebasket and or jump to another text in your preaching because their texts are really bad. Or what deconstruct. For example, you can go to Leviticus 18 where we find the holy or the sacred code, and there's one text there against homosexuality. But you can deconstruct the text if you analyze the whole chapter and say how stupid it is. That you can't just take one verse and say, when the verse before and before, this just doesn't make sense in modern society. You see? And you can turn it in a way that is constructive and helps your people understand the situation. So even a bad passage, if it's deconstruct, you can teach people how to think and how to see the things from another point of view. So you can use as a minister, what I did in my years when I was a minister, I usually had a whole day meeting with the leaders of my local church and start thinking together on the problems of the church or the problems of the people of the country and make a calendar of preaching. We together made a calendar and we're going to deal with this and we're going to that and that. And we had we even printed a calendar with the whole year of what went. Of course, there were things that will change, but it helped us to be more grounded in our lives, in not just but the lectionary is a good choice. Could be good, could be bad. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, once you understand the nature of metaphor and how it's used for God, you understand that every time any kid tells you, oh, that's not true, you shouldn't get defensive. Say, yeah, it's not true in terms of actuality. Yeah, that never happened. That's a myth, that's a story. But what does it mean? Right? What's the meaning? What's the agenda behind it? Is it good? Is it bad? It could be good, and you can still do good. So you are not asking, like Marcus Borg says that a lot, you cannot ask people to believe what's unbelievable. Right? Numbers talks about a donkey that starts talking, right? And even sees the angel with a sword and says to the prophet, don't keep going because the angel is going to kill you. And this is a case of Mr. Ed that is wiser than the prophet. In chapter 3, I dealt with worldview of the Bible. And that's very important because the worldview of the Bible is completely different from the actual current worldview we have. In the old worldview, you see that blue expansion. When you pass that blue expansion, there's heaven. And there are windows there to let the water down. And down in the earth, inside the earth, is the world of the death. And that started changing from just everybody goes there to, well, some go here and some go there. I mean, all that, you can't ask people to believe that. And there's something that Christians hate when I tell them this, because this is like the last wall. Peter Enns is a great, famous scholar. He wrote a book about Adam and Eve, and he talks and talks against the passage. It's not historical, and he says that the sin, what's the original sin, is not there either, and everything. But sadly, he touches with the resurrection of Christ, and he says, but I don't give up this. And I asked Pete, what? You are still holding to a world in which a human being was killed, came up again, like all the heroes, because you will see in my book, Hercules, was the Greek emperor, well, Augustus, and I mean, if you're a big guy, if you're a king or a hero, you're going to come out of the grave. And Jesus couldn't be less, of course. So in that world, Jesus came up, and he went to that world up there, and he's there, and he's going to come back. All that is myth. It's not true. Factually, it's not true. And if I'm sorry, if I rain on your parade, I am sorry, but that's how it is. Now, we can see the metaphors on that and see what's important, but you can't ask a modern person to believe in that world because we today know nothing about it. I mean, NASA has sent things all over. We have gone to Saturn, to Mars, to everywhere with our machines, and there's no heaven. And down there is not a parallel world like somebody tried to, maybe there's a, no. They said that down there's a world of the people that have died. Well, that's a question that all Christians ask. And of course, that question, when you push it to a radical view, usually the apologetics is, if you don't believe in God, for example, there's no morals. Everything, I mean, you lose everything. And I believe that human beings can't live without metaphors. And I believe even that it would be good to keep the God metaphor because that's the main metaphor. So we can't, in this modern world, we cannot live, because that's how our brain works. We not only quote metaphors as dressing here and there to enhance our writing, we think through metaphors. That's the way our brain works. And so that's the way it is. Let's keep the metaphors. Secondly, for me, I come, for example, to this place because I love the community. You say that it was said today that you're going to join a bigger group, right, to do good things. I will say, let me give you another example. We were canvassing for Emily Britson with a member of the church, with another member of the church. And we were going into apartment complex, coming in, coming out, coming in, all the knocking purse people. And suddenly, she's in front of me, and I say, we're doing the work of the Lord. You see, if you know me, you say, Humberto is not thinking, but he sees the metaphor. This is the work of the Lord. Not a real Lord that is alive up there, but a Lord that means the transformation of America. We want politicians that care about the poor, that care. I mean, for example, I would say that the approval of this bill, bipartisan bill by Biden, man, that's the work of the Lord. But I'm not a fundamentalist, so I'm not going to kill you or try to. I'm open for dialogue, and that's how it should be. We have a way of seeing things, but we respect. For example, I will respect my brother or sister in Christ that think in things are literally the way they are. Good. I will dialogue. I will try to get my point across. But if not, my first duty is to love, not to convince him or her about that. Fundamentalists, I would love that, because fundamentalists tends to be, maybe if he wins, I'm not going to be there next year. So it would be better. But I feel that if I don't think literary, that everything is literal, it doesn't take any joy about what this community is, what we're trying to do, and I feel we're doing the work of the Lord. Okay, thank you. Thank you.